Welcome to History for Granite. Join me to explore ancient Egypt. Please subscribe, and together we'll uncover secrets from the past written in stone. With a new and profound understanding of how the Great Pyramid shaped Egypt's civilization, it's time to look closer at why Khufu was so bold with his fully accessible pyramid. I am thrilled with how many people welcomed this new idea in the comments, and I commend you for advancing the discussion to a more sophisticated analysis of the pyramids. For anyone new to the channel, I recommend watching my last video on the Great Pyramid to get up to speed on where the research is now headed. However, you can expect Egyptologists to ignore or downplay the discovery as much as possible. Human nature is sadly quite predictable when it comes to matters of self-interest and self-importance. On that note, in this video, we will examine the psychology of self-preservation for the ancient Egyptians. We shall use the pyramids as evidence for what their priorities really were. The security of a tomb was a big concern in ancient Egypt once people started including valuable items in their burials. It created the incentive to disturb the dead, and thus affluent Egyptians needed to weigh the risks and benefits to having precious belongings interred with them. In early dynastic mastabas, there was a hierarchy of protection, whereby material goods were stored in magazines in the outer section of the mastaba. The body of the deceased received greater protection below ground and in the center of the structure. But these outer storerooms proved too easy to plunder, and thus eventually this design was abandoned in favor of keeping fewer grave goods closer to the body of the deceased. Egyptologist Reg Clark observes this change, writing, quote, "Concomitant with these changes, a noticeable increase in the space allocated to cult purposes becomes discernible at Saqqara, perhaps reflecting a change in an aspect of the superstructure's role, from part secure storehouse for grave goods to part chapel for the reception of offerings." End quote. This framework allows us to evaluate what made the Great Pyramid truly great, and to speculate about the reasoning which led to the decision to build the greatest wonder of the ancient world. I am personally reluctant to rely upon textual evidence of religious practices that come hundreds of years after the Great Pyramid. Of course, there is some good background knowledge there, but I find actions always speak louder than words. No matter what anyone claims their spiritual beliefs are, the actions of people are far more revealing about what their value system really is. In that context, I have always been struck by the enormous stockpiles of jars and vessels that are found in storerooms of Old Kingdom mastabas. Some of these structures had more than 100 antechambers, each stuffed to the brim with provisions for the afterlife. This is not a practice modern cultures engage in for burials, despite it being much easier to manufacture pottery in the present day. Therefore, it seems like an expensive ritual by the standards of antiquity. The only comparison to the present is hoarding, the kind you find in a survival bunker built to withstand war or the apocalypse. Consequently, these mountains of provisions for the afterlife don't come across as spiritual to me. They seem quite practical, and they have a smell about them that cannot be ignored. It's a smell everyone will recognize, and that smell is fear. The eternal afterlife is a very, very long time, and clearly the ancient Egyptians were concerned about running out of supplies in the underworld. Observing this fear of scarcity is important because it reveals there were constraints on the spiritual beliefs of ancient Egyptians and the superstitions that come with them. If spiritual magic could solve all their problems, they wouldn't need mountains of vessels to keep them sustained after death. One eternally refillable cup would be plenty, or maybe a dozen jars, each with a different favored beverage. But the extreme hoarding of provisions reveals a negotiation between superstition and reality. It shows that quantity still mattered for the religious transfer of sustenance to the afterlife. The belief that after death one relies upon provisions from the world of the living is a deep philosophical conundrum. For the rulers of ancient Egypt, it must have been considered a great paradox of their time. The ancients would have noticed an unbreakable pattern since their great civilization began, and this pattern would intensify as the grandeur of burials grew. No matter how powerful a pharaoh became, no matter how beloved his reign was, no matter his conquests or achievements, once he's dead, the next king in the line of succession becomes everyone's priority. Sure, a recently deceased pharaoh would be well cared for and have plenty of stored provisions and frequent offerings from those who knew and worshipped him. But over time, this attention would diminish, for it can only be expected that the tangible rewards for worshipping a living king are greater than those for worshipping a dead one. Thus, the older a burial was, the less attention and protection it received, and so eventually it would fall victim to plundering by people who neither remembered nor cared about the former greatness of the deceased. The early dynastic Egyptians attempted to thwart this pattern of neglect by making mastabas a fortress of material obstruction and stuffing them to the brim with offerings. But no matter how massive the mastaba was, these mountains of earth could not stop intrusions if the burials were unattended by the living. Seeing this pattern would torment any pharaoh planning for a plentiful afterlife, and all their thought would be bent upon it. It is this concern that incentivized King Djoser of the Third Dynasty to build an enormous burial complex in stone. Djoser selected the site of Saqqara, which was already revered in ancient Egypt, and constructed a walled fortress for his resting place. Here, the first pyramid ever constructed was built in no less than 6 iterations, demonstrating a rapidly evolving idea of what a necropolis could be. This limestone city of the dead may have been the biggest spectacle of its time, and no doubt Djoser was pleased with the attention it brought as he continued to expand and build upon it. It seems likely Djoser was ultimately buried somewhere in the many shafts and chambers around his pyramid. But only a historian's fallacy will assert this oversized granite box must have been his final resting place. The unique complex of Djoser would never be replicated by another pharaoh, but the concept of a pyramid became a symbol of enduring attention and veneration. The next pharaoh to successfully complete a pyramid was Snefru, first king of the 4th dynasty. He builds 3 enormous pyramids, and all of them have chambers that might have been intended for a burial. The internal layout of Snefru's pyramids all have lower chambers that could be easily accessed, and a single upper chamber that was much better protected. The common denominator is each pyramid is seeking a balance between allowing people to enter while keeping a separate area more private. The ultimate example of this is the Bent Pyramid, which abandons the idea of a permanently sealed upper chamber by connecting a tunnel to it afterwards and leaving a portcullis open to facilitate access. After Snefru, Kufu builds the Great Pyramid, and his innovative portcullis allows a physically secure burial chamber that can be opened so that offerings may be brought directly to him. As this pyramid is the earliest one with a sarcophagus, it could have been the first pyramid to receive the body of a pharaoh. As the son of Snefru, Kufu would have noticed a pattern about the numerous pyramids his father had constructed. He would have observed that no matter how restricted or sacred these pyramids were, people in Egypt with wealth or influence would endeavor to have a look inside for themselves. Sure, there were impressive temples and statues to inspire awe, and those would have been visited as well. But the pyramids, well, the pyramids were something else. The pyramids were truly divine, something that would attract people to them like nothing else before. So despite whatever privilege was required for someone to enter, the less privileged would seek to bribe their way inside with whatever offerings were required. This is not speculation, because we can observe this pattern throughout history. To this very day, most of Egypt's tourism revenue comes from visitors to the pyramids. Observing the unique power of a pyramid to eternally draw attention is what inspired Khufu to build bigger and grander than ever before. The Great Pyramid would be so magnificent that he could ensure the offerings would never cease and his prosperous afterlife would be secured. Naysaying academics will claim they already knew this and insist there's no reason Khufu would need offerings brought directly within his burial chamber. They'll say the Egyptians had false doors and that these spiritual portals could transport the pharaoh to his offerings as necessary. This is the type of thinking one would expect from a priest, but the mindset of a pharaoh is something different. We can all recognize in the present day that for those who possess the most wealth, there is no extravagance which will not be pursued. There are seemingly no limits to human desire, and just because a false door could work doesn't mean it would be good enough. The subject of false doors is important to consider, so let's examine them in pyramids. The 3 pyramids which follow the Great Pyramid all have false doors carved directly in front of their portcullises. False doors are the only decoration carved into 4th and most 5th dynasty pyramids, and thus they must have been of the highest importance. But just like the mountains of jars found inside of mastabas, there were constraints on how effective Egyptians thought false doors could be. Why else would Menkaure need 30 of them in his vestibule and totally covering his sarcophagus? If magic can solve any problem, you don't need so much redundancy. Whether it's piles of jars or a parade of false doors, the pharaohs of Egypt were attempting to make access to provisions as easy as possible. In that context, it's no wonder that having a fully accessible burial chamber would be the ultimate accomplishment. The limits of false doors and stored provisions are made irrelevant because room service is now available. Let's compare this idea to what else has been proposed by some Egyptologists. Here is Zahi Hawass explaining what he thought Pharaoh Djoser was planning for in the afterlife.
For the afterlife, that the king has to go through these tunnels and having knives in his hand, killing the wild creatures until he can actually go and meet Osiris.
I'll throw out my own wild speculation that the richest, most pampered individuals in ancient Egypt did not plan for fighting wild beasts in their eternal afterlife. I don't know what propaganda gave Hawass this idea, but the physical evidence within pyramids suggests comfort and companionship was the goal for the deceased. You don't find piles of knives and spears in the storerooms of Egyptian burials. You find furniture and vessels for food and drink. As mentioned earlier by Reg Clark, Old Kingdom mastabas evolved towards a place where offerings would be brought rather than stored, and it only makes sense to evaluate pyramids in that same context. But if you think of the Great Pyramid as an oversized and poorly conceived hiding place for a body, it's no wonder you find yourself quite confused.
The ironic thing about a pyramid is it secures the royal burial within, and yet it advertises the royal burials right here.
I hope you will never tire of hearing sound bites like that one, because there are nearly as many as there are stones in the pyramids. The Great Pyramid outshined every Old Kingdom pyramid which came after it, although they all sought the same goal of creating a place where worship and offerings would never cease. Like so many innovations, the first version is a proof of concept. If it works properly, then later designs get simplified and streamlined. Notably, the only chamber design from the Great Pyramid which persists through the end of the Old Kingdom is the triple portcullis. It represents the ultimate accomplishment of keeping the deceased pharaoh as well cared for as possible.
The Great Pyramid, although it's the classic pyramid in the popular imagination, is actually the most unusual. It's a huge anomaly.
Egyptologist Mark Lehner is incorrect for many reasons, but what he really misses is the ancient Egyptians would have the same reaction to the Great Pyramid as we do today. There's something special about being the first to innovate an accessible pyramid, as well as being the largest ever built. However, being the greatest of all time did come with some unpredictable side effects. What Khufu accomplished, which nobody had done before, is that even after his death, the Great Pyramid would have been the main attraction. The psychology of this is undeniable, and it resonated for thousands of years. It's even represented today by the highest ticket price for entering a pyramid. Prior to the Great Pyramid, a living pharaoh could always count on being number one, despite the accomplishments of his predecessors. But after a few generations, one wonders how pharaohs would have responded to living in the shadow of greatness. Perhaps some would resent the Great Pyramid as a monument which siphoned off attention from their own divinity. This may explain some of the peculiar effects that had befallen Khufu's legacy. Perhaps it's why the Great Pyramid is the only pyramid with its summit flattened, because someone wanted to take it down a notch. Perhaps it's why later accounts of Khufu from Herodotus are quite negative, because stories were fabricated to ruin his reputation. Perhaps it's why we find a stolen relief of Khufu inside the burial chamber of Pharaoh Unas. And perhaps it's why no statues of Khufu ever survived, except for this miniature carving which Flinders Petrie miraculously saved. Egyptologist John Romer thinks this occurrence is purely random.
Why is this the only thing that remains of Khufu?
It's just chance. All of ancient Egypt, what's left is just chance. You get one king, you get 100 statues, you get the guy who makes the Great Pyramid, you end up with this.
However, I have my suspicions that in drawing so much attention to himself, Khufu's legacy was forever complicated by the incentive to one-up him by later pharaohs. Another interesting question is how the practice of bringing offerings directly to a burial chamber within a pyramid might evolve over time. The logistics of opening and closing a portcullis are not simple, and so perhaps some compromises were made so that full entry into a pyramid was not always required. This may explain the vestibules that start with the Pyramid of Menkaure. They are small rooms at the bottom of the entrance passage where offerings could be made without passing the portcullis and into the burial chamber. From the Pyramid of Menkaure onwards, there are also small storage magazines deeper inside the pyramid. Perhaps more permanent belongings could be kept there and attended to on a less frequent basis. This, of course, raises the question, where were belongings stored in the Great Pyramid? But the Great Pyramid's portcullis was more maneuverable than any other, and I wonder if Khufu thought he wouldn't need anything permanently stored with him. Perhaps he was even a true philosopher king, and only wished for food and companionship in the afterlife. After all, treasures are of little comfort if you are alone and starving in the underworld. While much of these ideas are speculative, there is a way we can objectively evaluate what the ancient Egyptians thought about permanently accessible pyramids. Eventually, the pyramid party was over, and Old Kingdom Egypt ended with the death of Pharaoh Pepi II. The centralized government of Egypt collapsed, and civil war and chaos would persist for at least a century. It is this time, known as the First Intermediate Period, when it is presumed most pyramids were abandoned. But as Pepi II was the last pharaoh to reign over the whole nation, it should be expected that some centralized power would still protect his pyramid complex longer than his predecessors. The cult of Pepi II would have some legacy resources before Egypt was fully engulfed in chaos. So, what did the cult of Pepi II do as they realized other pyramids were being abandoned? They took drastic action to make the pyramid permanently sealed. The chapel around the north entrance was removed, and a large belt of stones was constructed around the entire pyramid. These blocks were at least 6.5 meters wide and a minimum of 2 courses tall against the casing stones. This belt would have camouflaged the entrance and made it more physically secure than any other pyramid. Even the enclosure walls had to be moved to accommodate this belt of stone. Egyptologist Gustave Jequier thought this belt of stone was to somehow prevent the pyramid from collapsing. No physical evidence was presented to support this idea, nor is it clear to me how such a belt of stone would be intended to stabilize the pyramid in any way. Of the destroyed chapel at the pyramid's entrance, Jequier writes, quote, "There is every reason to believe that a new chapel was built in the same place, but I have not been able to find the slightest vestige of it." End quote. I have one good reason to believe that a new entrance chapel was never constructed, because this modification represents the change from accessible pyramids to permanently closed ones. The final gambit of Pepi II's pyramid shows us exactly how ancient Egyptians would go about permanently sealing a burial. In that context, the pyramids before Pepi II seem intended for continued access, and so the dream of Khufu persisted until civilization could no longer protect him. The question of how often pyramids were fully entered by their worshippers may be endlessly debated, but clearly it was not a token amount. Otherwise, Pepi II would not have been the only pharaoh to modify a permanent closure once the dream of eternal worship faded away. The ancient Egyptians may have entered pyramids daily, weekly, yearly, or only once in a generation. But whatever the frequency was, it's what the physical evidence shows the pyramids were designed for. The alternative is to claim the pyramids were complete failures. From the earliest pyramids of Snefru to the final pyramid of the Old Kingdom, Egyptologists have proclaimed these pyramids were collapsing to explain their anomalies. They see failure every step of the way, and this is a great shame. In fact, when the Old Kingdom ended and the dream of pyramids was shattered, perhaps the pharaohs and their belongings were interred elsewhere out of sight. Maybe this is why mummy fragments have been so conspicuously absent from the pyramids. Maybe this is why Herodotus proclaimed the Giza pyramids were not the final resting place of the pharaohs. Perhaps every robber's tunnel found a completely emptied pyramid, and perhaps Egyptology has overlooked that the ancient Egyptians were far more clever than we ever imagined. Thanks to everyone who watched this video to the end. Please subscribe to the channel to see more of this content. Give a like or comment as you see fit, and above all, remember to ask your friends if they take their history for granted.